About, there's no structure. They don't respect authority on that level. And they will sniff you out, as he said. Once they find out you playing games with them, they'll shut down and they'll move on to the next.
Everybody here is familiar with phenomenal, and I don't mean that in a good way, body count in Chicago. So much so that the nickname is Chirac.
More African American males die in Chicago per day than in Afghanistan.
Absolutely right. Numbers far exceeded Afghanistan at this point. Right. Now, the significance of that is this, and again, this has been studied. It's just a pattern. You break up organization, you have what? Disorganization. When you have disorganization, you have what? Chaos. What we're looking at in Chicago right now, what we're looking at is the direct result of the federal suppression activity in Chicago against street crew organizations in 1986. Now, am I saying suppression is bad? No, we need law enforcement. We need law enforcement. But when we as a community don't do our jobs so that we diminish the need for law enforcement and diminish the need for suppression, we can't complain when suppression comes in and takes away the leadership. See, those of us that know the streets know when we talk about the glory days when the hood was good. We talk about the glory days when the streets took care of the community, when the gangsters were real gentlemen, when there was rules and there was a code to the streets, right? That's called leadership. Am I saying that that's a good thing? Not when it comes to endorsing or promoting criminal activity, no. But when it comes to providing guidance for the next generation coming up, absolutely. When that leadership goes, there's no guidance for the young ones, what do you think's going to happen? Look at Chicago. This is what we're seeing here in Syracuse. Per capita, it's not much better. It's not much better. When I can go back to New York City, to Manhattan or the Bronx and mention Syracuse, and New Yorkers go, oh, you don't got no bullet holes? Oh man, when it rains it pours up there. They start shouting out certain streets like, yeah, like, oh, that's a dangerous street. What is it, Salina? What is it, Newell? Oh, that's they know. Never been to Syracuse, but they know about it. You know, that's bad. Now, the whole thing with violence, I want to put that out there real quick. The whole connection with gangs and violence from the gangster's mindset, from the urban youth's mindset or state of mind. He lives every day in a state of constant paranoia because he doesn't feel, or she doesn't feel, that they have any control over their own circumstances. When that's the case, they're fiending for any opportunity to feel like they have control over their circumstances. If it means get some of that control off of you, then you're the victim that day. That's just what it is. So to those in the streets, violence is a means to an end. It's a means to feel powerful. And it's not violence most of the time. It is the threat of violence. It is now conversely, those of us on the outside, it's not really the violence, it's just like a horror film. You're not horrified at Jason chopping up bodies. You're horrified at the weird music and the suspense a few seconds before he does. Let's be real. It's the threat of violence that horrifies us, that causes us to be polarized in our mind and say, oh, there was a shooting at 4 a.m. On such and such street, it must be gang related. That's the big mistake we make. We start to associate violence with gang activity, and they're not mutually exclusive. But that's our fault. That's because we're scared. Let's just be honest. You see? How does that play into the mindset of the youth? They love it. You're scared, they feel powerful. They feel strong. It's just that simple. Okay.
You done now? Yeah. All right. Got it. I think we also need to look at what we're offering our youth. Man, we have these centers that do programs for youth that offer them things, but I lived for a while in Medellin, Colombia, a very notoriously violent city that took, in order to turn their city around, there's still violence, but they have reduced significantly the amount of deaths in that city because they took the emphasis off of policing and started giving kids things to do. And I think we have centers that are doing things, but when I look at Columbia, they took police barracks, shut them down, and turned them into community centers that gave kids cellos, gave kids violins, and said, here, let's create a community orchestra, and gave them things to do to create their community. They gave them agency within the community. And so here we are sitting here talking about youth, but we're not talking with them. We're not having these kids that should be in schools that are out on the streets in here talking with us about what we are doing to them and what we should be doing with them. So I think that might help.
I'll just add real quick, 'cause it was all really good stuff. With the question, what does violence or the threat of violence represent in a gang? I think we all know, and what everyone just discussed was perfect. But coming from experience, I also believe it represents, if you can cause someone fear, you can control a person. Fear controls people. A lot of us, if you even think of your own life, whatever you're afraid of, if you're afraid of a certain sickness, you might be afraid to go to the doctor, it controls your life. So I knew when I was growing up, if I could knock somebody out and I knew all my other friends now fear me, I suddenly got this great persona now that built myself up, and I knew I could control other people through manipulation through that fear. So I think a lot of, just like everyone says, perfect, but we also got to realize is that fear of the threat of violence, I think it's perfect what he says, is that threat of the violence that causes that fear, even more so than the violence itself sometimes.
Pretty much everyone touched on some powerful points. It was an analogy I used to talk to my kids at Hillbrook, and it was, it's something I still think about every day. And just to piggyback off what Noble said about what we pay attention to. And many of you, if you know this parable, help me out, bear with me. I can't remember. I'm just going to touch on it, paraphrase it. But it's a Native American tale about a grandfather and his grandson. His grandson came to him and told him about a dream he had with two wolves that was fighting. And he asked his grandfather which one will win. Because he said every night he just fight. And he said the one you feed the most. Right? So it's just like Noble said, what we paying attention to. And I just made a statement a couple weeks ago to someone about how in our community, young people have probably been to more funerals than graduation parties. You know what I'm saying? And that's sad. That's unfortunate. You know what I mean? Because then when they see churches unfortunately packed with hundreds of thousands of people, that's some attention. And it's unbelievable, and it's almost a state of suicidal thoughts. Because now I'm willing to go out and put my life on the line because I know somewhere along the line I'll be a martyr. My name will be on walls, T-shirts, and things like that. So, it's what we give our attention to.
Also, too, when you talk about the violence, reality is an agreement, right? And it seems as though we agree with the violence on some level, right? Acceptance. We've taken the ostrich approach. And stick our head in the sand and pray that it go away, right? But you forget the ostrich leaves his backside open, and ours is getting kicked. And this contract of reality that we're living under is written in the blood of the children, right? Adults don't like to think in that manner, like, no, they doing that on their own, or these kids are crazy. Like, they didn't fall from outer space and just start shooting, right? They belong to families and people in the community. Now, the sad thing is this. We know what goes on in the streets, from household to household. We know who children are doing the shooting. We would talk about those people like it's no tomorrow instead of going to that parent or to that household and say, listen, we got to do something to help out this young person, right? So we don't even love or care enough on that level to reach out to your neighbors. That's why they call it the hood. I understand they dropped the neighbor off. Right? So now it's the hood, but with the hood comes certain mannerisms. You see the t-shirts that say welcome to the hood. It's a gun and a knife on the front. So that agreement that they have, they're communicating on a level where we can't reach them. Now when you got 5 and 6 year old children that can listen to gunshots and say, oh, I think that was a 45. No, it was a 380. Or it's a 22. And they start to go toward the action versus away from it. Even they've been desensitized because they're children of war. But we don't see it in that frame of fashion because when you talk war, it has to be political. Well, they have their own politics. The streets reinforce its own existence. Every time you go to a funeral, every time you see a shooting or a stabbing, it shows that it exists, whether you want to agree with it or not. And then some of us think we bulletproof. You go to the mall, you go to the grocery store, you frequent downtown, so A plus B equals C. Nobody's safe. There's not one place in Syracuse right now we could call a safe zone. Because they'll shoot at a funeral, at a graduation party, at stabbings at the mall, you name it. Right? And everybody's just walking around in zombie land like this stuff not going on around us. Or have the nerve to say it's those children. Right. Or it's those people. Right? So even Syracuse as a collective, which we're I know a lot of this sounds depressing, or some people might take the stance of hopelessness, but this is an opportune time for us to muster some strength, develop some strategies, and shift the paradigm of this whole community for the next 50 years. But we have to have the thought first to put that out there before we can start working in that direction. Because if we don't, there's some young people that's coming up now that's 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 years old. They're going to be a lot worse than what you're seeing right now.
You know, when Noble spoke about many of us sticking our heads in the sand and trying to ignore the issue and hoping that it goes away, that is no better than people outside of our community petitioning to get certain types of legislation passed that allows them to monetarily benefit off of legislation directed at gang activity. One is called dehumanization by commission. One is called dehumanization by omission. We're both equally guilty. When we stick our heads in the sand or play high and mighty while stepping over the bodies of our children saying everything's going to be all right, what we're doing is we're dehumanizing them, and that's what allows these types of things to happen. That's why when Noble says gangs trauma, people go and don't want to listen. Because if you recognize those are effects of trauma, then you have to humanize them. If you recognize that those are effects of trauma, maybe they need a doctor and not a jail cell. You see? But there's no money there. Let's just be honest. Let's be honest with each other. There's no money there. You see? The dreaded question that we all have to ask ourselves with all of this is we take our emotions out of it, take our fear of gunshots and blood out of it, and ask the one dreaded question: who benefits? See,